Okay, welcome this morning. I guess this won't count against my minutes. Hey? Okay, I just want to, first of all, of course, thank the organizers for organizing such a great conference. And we can say that since we've been doing it for 2 full days. And it's been great listening to so many outstanding presentations. I also will just assume my position now as a PERI person and thank Nicole Dunham, if she's in the room, our administrative director who makes all this happen. I've got a bunch of people to thank. This is like the Academy Awards. The person I really have to thank the most is Diana Barraclough from UNCTAD, who asked me, it seems like 18 years ago, to write this paper on fossil fuel subsidies. And not 18 years, but too long. And Richard Kozel-Wright, also as of UNCTAD, when you quit, before you quit, who supported this work. So when they asked me, when I started discussing this with Diana a couple of years ago, and she said, we'd be interested in you studying either fossil fuel subsidies or green central banking. And I said, well, I'm really interested in both, but I guess my preference is for green central banking. And I guess I didn't know Diana well enough because she said, okay, then do fossil fuel subsidies. So that's how this paper came about. And I have to thank them for their extreme patience. And yes, it actually is done. And you're not even at UNCTAD anymore. But the paper is basically done. And I have to thank also, of course, my co-authors, Shovik Chakraborty and Gregor Semenuk. Though I must say that we haven't even discussed the final version, or at least the version that I'm about to present. So when Diana asked me to do it, she asked me to give a broad framework for understanding fossil fuel subsidies globally, and then to focus on 2 case studies. And the case studies are India and Indonesia. And that's what I've done. And in this brief presentation, I will give some of the overview and then just talk about the Indonesian case. We obviously can talk about the Indian case as well during the discussion period. Okay. Now some background points. The conference has been really great, I think, in integrating 2 perspectives on sovereign debt and climate finance. One, which we could call a north-south dichotomy, conflict, with the IMF acting as kind of the hammer on behalf of the rich countries. And that's one framework. And the second one is in terms of class, between high-income people, rich people, Wall Street, big capital, and their interests, and everybody else. Both of those perspectives, I think, have been really well represented at the conference, especially in the session on winners and losers yesterday. I thought both perspectives were well discussed. This approach, the discussion that we're going to have here is on class and income distribution within the context of developing economies, and in particular Indonesia. Just a little bit more further background. When we talk about fossil fuel subsidies, I'm going to just read a little bit from the intro to the paper just to make sure I'm not misunderstood on what I mean and the approach. Fossil fuel subsidies clearly constitute an obstacle to advancing a viable global climate stabilization program. Obvious in the sense that the very first imperative for achieving climate stabilization is to stop burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy, period. No matter what else we have to do, if we are going to take climate science seriously, and if we really are going to move on to any kind of viable stabilization path, we have to get rid of fossil fuels, okay? That's it. And in that context, fossil fuel subsidies create perverse incentives, encouraging both consumers to continue purchasing fossil fuel energy and producers to continue producing it. They also represent a huge financial resource that could be mobilized to help finance the transition to a clean energy dominant energy infrastructure. Within any viable global climate stabilization project, a first order priority will be to build a clean energy infrastructure capable of supplanting the existing fossil fuel dominant infrastructure. At the same time, in many countries, fossil fuel subsidies provide critical support to low-income people by reducing the costs they must pay to meet their energy needs. Fossil fuel subsidies also support business activity in many countries by lowering their energy input costs. This reduction in business energy input costs can then become a stimulus for expanding overall economic activity and job creation. All of this is true despite the fact that, as I'm going to go into, fossil fuel subsidies are massively regressive in implementation. And nevertheless, any workable program to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies must also establish alternative measures to maintain support for consumers and producers that are justifiable, independent of whether fossil fuel subsidies are the policy instrument used to provide such support. Okay. Now, then we're going to move into, how do we move this thing? Okay. So I was talking with a few friends right before. Why did this paper take so long? Well, it actually is really hard to know exactly what you mean when you say a fossil fuel subsidy, and even harder to try to measure it. So defining and measuring fossil fuel subsidies is a lot of the work that we ended up doing on this. I will not go through all that. I'll just give a little flavor, and certainly we can discuss it during the Q&A if people are interested. So broadly speaking, we can talk about two kinds of subsidies: explicit and implicit subsidies. Explicit subsidies are what you think of as subsidies, are the public sector losing revenue, transferring funds to whomever. Implicit subsidies are subsidies as defined most prominently by the IMF and the attempt to capture quantitatively the environmental costs and externalities associated with burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy. And here's something from the IMF, which tries to measure and report on the extent of implicit and explicit subsidies. First of all, the light blue in these bars is the implicit subsidies. So those are our externalities. The gray bar is the explicit subsidy. The first thing that strikes one in looking at it is obviously, according to the IMF, implicit subsidies are much bigger. And you hear, I think whenever it came out in the last few months, the most recent report, it came out in the news, fossil fuel subsidies are $7 trillion. And that's exactly the number from the IMF. But that is implicit as well as explicit subsidies. Okay, if we're actually only going to focus on explicit subsidies, the amount that governments are paying out for whatever to whomever, but actually resources transferred, that the gray bar, the numbers are still actually really big. They just don't look big when you include the implicit subsidies. So the explicit subsidies, according to the IMF, 2022 was about 1.5 trillion. So that's real money. It just doesn't look that big compared to the implicit. Now, we can debate about the implicit subsidies. I'm going to focus on explicit subsidies because that is the pot of money from which we can maybe extract some and do something with it. Okay, this is something from the International Renewable Energy Agency, which provides a typology of energy subsidies, explicit subsidies. And you can see these are things of which we're all familiar. So direct financial transfers, preferential tax treatment, trade restrictions, energy-related services by government at less than full cost, regulation of the energy sector. So the last one is not, there's not a lot of money directly being transferred here. But the other ones are where we're actually seeing a lot of the action. Now, even within this, there are lots of issues, methodological issues, as to how one actually would define these, and even more so, how you measure them. And again, I will not go into it, though it is quite extensive in our paper, how we do it. So I'm going to jump directly to estimates as to the distributional effects. Okay, so this shows us distributional impact of subsidies within developing countries. This is not a study by me, and this is Arza Del Grando et al. So 20 developing economies. And what you can see here by quintile, the fossil fuel subsidies as a percent of household income, interestingly, among all quintiles, according to this estimate, we're looking at about 5.5% of income. The subsidies represent about 5.5% of all quintiles. Now, of course, the impact of 5.5% of income is quite different when you are living at a level of basic needs versus when you're living at a high income level. To take away 5% of income means taking away, for a low income household in the bottom quintile, means taking away income that would be spent on basic needs. Not true for high income. Okay. Secondly, obviously, when we talk about shares of income as our metric, that then, when you translate that into how much income people have, the amount of resources transferred by quintile is obviously going to reflect the differences in income levels. So that in this in the second column, what we're showing is the share of total fossil fuel subsidies benefits of the total being 100%, wherein the bottom quintile gets 7.2% and the top quintile gets 43%. So clearly, again, we see fossil fuel subsidies, yes, are critical to the well-being of the bottom quintile. They need that 5.5% of their income. But in terms of the distribution of the benefits, massively, massively regressive. Moreover, those figures actually understate quite significantly the degree to which fossil fuel subsidies are regressive. Why? Well, because those are just the consumption subsidies, and production subsidies obviously go into the pockets of the producers. Okay, number one. Number two, even if we only focus on consumption subsidies, we have to recognize that in the absence of the consumption subsidies, people would consume less fossil fuel. And as a consequence, oil companies would sell less oil. Okay? So it's a simple exercise here, just to kind of illustrate this point. Looking at the literature, here, these are some kind of rough figures from the literature. This is from a survey paper looking at price elasticity of demand for fossil fuels, short-run elasticity, long-run elasticity. negative 0.33 in the short run, negative 0.61 in the long run. Okay, working from those elasticities. Now, there's another paper that I reference in the study. What has happened in cases where fossil fuel subsidies were eliminated? How much have prices gone up? And the answer is roughly, on average, 50, let's say 50%. So if we have a 50% increase in oil, petroleum, fossil fuel products, and we're looking at a range of price elasticities of 0.33 to 0.61, and even if I take the low end and I say, okay, let's say we're looking, it's a 50% increase, so that means that the range of the elasticity, the demand reduction is going to be between 17 and 30%. So I said, let's call it 20%. For the year 2022, a 20% decline in revenue is $700 billion for oil companies. So that isn't captured. Okay, next, let's just look a bit at the fossil fuel subsidy pattern globally. And I have two time series here because, again, I won't go through it unless in this Q&A you want to. There's all these estimates. And after a long time with Shovik and Gregor and myself, we came to the conclusion that, well, we can probably trust this one, the fossil fuel subsidy tracker, FFST. The OECD and the International Energy Agency actually, they recommend that they combine their two estimates because they themselves don't trust themselves fully. But the point is that the OECD, IEA, and the FFST end up being about the same, and the FFST number is easily accessible, so we're going to go with that one. Okay, now subsidies as a share of GDP. These are global subsidies. You can see it. These are real 2022 dollars and global subsidies as a share of GDP, and we can see that the pattern is the same as a share of GDP or in real dollars. And we do see this dip, okay, because there was indeed some movement to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, but now we see the resurgence. And why is there a resurgence? Well, that's also pretty obvious. Here's what happens when you look at the relationship between the subsidies as a share of GDP relative to the global crude oil price. That's Brent crude. So basically here what we're looking at is basically the movements of fossil fuel subsidies, not entirely, but largely reflect variation in the global price of oil. So whatever else we may talk about in terms of efforts at reform, broadly speaking, we are still in a world in which variation in fossil fuel subsidies reflect variation in oil prices. The correlation coefficient there is 0.84. And then just quickly, this shows you the share of the fossil fuel subsidies by energy source. And one might say, oh, look, we are getting rid of coal subsidies because that's the red line that's real low. Not true, because the electricity subsidies are almost entirely the electricity is almost entirely generated by burning coal. So basically, oil and coal remain very high level of subsidy, with natural gas a little lower. Okay, now the question about fossil fuel phase out. There is a very large literature, extremely large literature of all kinds, including, you know, neoliberals. Of course, any subsidy is stupid. But you know, here's kind of where I think the literature is going to land. That is at least the literature that recognizes that, yeah, fossil fuel subsidies at present are imperative to sustaining the well-being of low-income people throughout the world. So the kind of where the literature lands is on these points that we are, if we're going to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, of course, we've got to come up with alternatives. And that would be cash or some kind of in-kind transfer as a substitute, number one. Number two, it can't just be short-term stopgap because fossil fuel subsidies haven't been short-term stopgap. And, that when I was thanking everybody, you weren't supposed to count those minutes. Oh, you did? Just not long enough. All right. Okay, and and they talk about compensation for private sector firms, and I think after much digging into the literature, there's not much to argue with those points as such, but here's the problem: you can't just say we've got to have alternative cash or in-kind transfers. You have to say how big are they going to be. And not just how big are they going to be, how long are they going to last? You can't just, you can't get rid of the subsidies and say, well, my God, if we get rid of the subsidies, there's going to be riots. So let's give people some in-kind transfer for 3 months. You can't do that. And then secondly, they do talk about revenue redistribution and reinvestment. They don't talk about it to the extent that we're focused on building a clean energy infrastructure. And third, most of the literature, of course, doesn't take account of the fact that because these subsidies are so massively regressive, so beneficial to high-income people and fossil fuel corporations in particular, that we have to take account of the opposition that they are going to, that they will build against getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, quick on the Indonesia case. Since you've already seen this for the global case, the patterns for Indonesia, and for that matter, India, kind of look the same. Subsidies as share of GDP. Global price of oil is driving India's subsidies. The correlation coefficient there is 0.94. Okay. Now, here we go with the distributional impact. Pattern is similar to what we saw globally, depending, these are two different studies, one from 2015, one from 2022. Again, the richest get the massively larger share. I converted these just to US dollars based on the 2022 level of fossil fuel subsidies in Indonesia, which was about $50 billion. And you could see the poorest 10% get, on average, households $187. The richest 10% get over $2,000. That's why they like fossil fuel subsidies. This doesn't even include the corporations again. Okay, now, Indonesia, to their credit, and India also, have introduced measures to compensate for efforts to reform or phase down fossil fuel subsidies. And this shows you the interventions that they've undertaken at different points when they tried to get rid of the subsidies, 2005, 2008, 2013. So they are various kinds of cash or in-kind subsidies. Again, but the problem is, without going into the details, there's a lot of words there. They sound like they're good programs. They're too small and they're too short term. So here's even from the World Bank reflecting on the even more recent one, 2022, when the alternative cash transfer program was introduced to alleviate the impact of the 30% rise in diesel and gasoline. 20 million beneficiaries, 30% of households. Well, that's not enough households. I mean, are we only targeting the very poor? Each beneficiary will receive IDR 600,000, 2 installments, September, December. Well, that doesn't get you very far when the price of oil has gone up and is staying up. So that's just for a few months. Estimates that this will mitigate the cost for the bottom 40% and reverse poverty impact by 0.28 percentage points, and as a one-off cash transfer, the positive poverty contribution may not be sustained. Of course it won't be sustained because they're getting rid of the program after 6 months. Okay, so quickly to close out, what we then try to do is say, let's think about alternative compensation that is sustainable, that is egalitarian. And so the very simple thing you're looking at is saying, okay, we have the level in the first column, the extent of the fossil fuel subsidies by decile, income decile. So we just say, let's set that subsidy level for everybody, all households, at the level of the 41st to 50th percentile. So that's $539 in US dollars. And every household gets it up to the 70th percentile. And what would be the distributive impact? And as you could see, for the poorest 10%, they're getting a huge, they're basically more than doubling the extent of their subsidy. So from $187, they get $539. For the 11th to 20th percentile, and then they were, instead of $295, they're also getting $539. So we run through that, and of course, for the after the 50th percentile, there is a net loss. And then the second variant, we say, well, let's make it a universal program where everybody, no matter who you are, every household gets $539. The advantage of that is administratively, it's much easier. You don't have to figure out where to cut off. And so you still get, the massive egalitarian impact. Now, add it all up. So what happens when you do that? So here we go with the 2022 for Indonesia. The fossil fuel subsidies were $50 billion. The Indonesian GDP 2022 was $1.3 trillion. Now, if we're going to do the scenario one with the limited compensation, total outlay for the government is $26 billion. It's still 2% of GDP. But it was, before it was 3.5% of GDP. So we're saving 1.5% of GDP, which is $23.4 billion. And then I just scaled that. Let's say, let's look at that $23.4 billion relative to how much Indonesia spent in 2022, or how much investment took place in Indonesia in 2022 on clean energy. And the answer is they spent, not they, 1.6 billion was spent in Indonesia 2022. The amount that could be channeled into clean energy investments through getting rid of these regressive subsidies is 15 times larger. 15 times larger, even after you get this egalitarian redistribution through alternative subsidies. And then under the universal compensation, so that even the top 3 deciles, they're also getting $539. Even then, we end up with $12.4 billion in savings, 1% of GDP, it's a lot, and that's 8 times larger than what was spent in Indonesia on clean energy investments in 2022. Okay, so that's the basics. There's a lot of things that are in between there, and we can go through it in the Q&A. Thank you.